All right, good evening. It is Wednesday, July 20th, 2022, 6:31 p.m. We're in the council chambers, and this is calling to order the Building Board of Appeals for a study session this evening.
And I think we can turn it over to John to talk to us. The topic tonight is an update on the international codes and certain amendments that we might be making over the course of the next couple months.
So good evening, as Reed said, I'm John Schumacher. I'm the Chief Building Official with the Building Division, and we are here tonight to talk about proposed amendments to the 2021 International Codes and 2020 National Electrical Code. So a little bit of the history of the international codes in the city of Littleton. Our last adoption process was in 2014. During that process, we adopted the 2012 international codes. Since then, the International Code Council has published versions in 2015, 2018, and the version 2021 that we're looking at this evening. We, in our process to adopt the 2012 codes, had a significant number of amendments to those codes. We began a process to adopt the 2018 I-codes, which started in 2018, and we stopped in 2019. At that time in 2019, we looked at the fact that we weren't that far along in our process, and that in 2020, the 2021 codes would be coming out, the first edition of those. And so we decided to start the process in 2020 with these 2021 codes that we're looking at this evening. We should, if we stay on track, would be complete this year in November. This process that we're entering into now adopts all of the same codes that we already have adopted, with the addition of the existing building code. As I go through this, please stop me if you have any questions. So there's a list of these codes that we're adopting. We have the building code, the residential code, the plumbing code, mechanical code, fuel gas code, energy conservation code, fire code, property maintenance, electrical, the 1997 Uniform Code for the Abatement of Dangerous Buildings. Those are all codes that we currently have adopted. We're also, as I said in the previous slide, adopting the International Building Code, or existing building code. We have been engaged in this process since 2020. And what we have remaining in this process at this point is we had a contractors meeting on July 12th, in which we presented these same amendments in this same presentation. We have tonight's meeting with this board, next week with City Council on Tuesday. After meeting with City Council, we'll come back next month to this board again with any changes that have been proposed through this evening's process and the City Council process next week, to request a resolution of support for the final draft, and then take the ordinance in ordinance format to the City Council in October for first reading, November for public hearing, second reading. All right, so we'll get right to the amendments to the codes. There are a number of administrative amendments that are applicable to all of the I-codes that we intend to adopt in the 2021 version. This list of amendments that I'm getting ready to go over applies to all of those codes. We're going to propose to delete the annual permits section in each of the codes. We also are coordinating work exempt from permit sections throughout the code so that all of those lists of work exempt are the same. We are removing exemptions for fences and decks. We are requiring permits, removing the exemption for sheds that are over or under 120 square feet, and then at that time in the code said just 120 square feet. Now in conjunction with our ULUC, we're proposing that it's under 120 square feet and less than 8 feet in height. Permits would now be valid for 365 days instead of 180 days, but there would be no automatic extension by inspection. Permit valuations are clarified in the amendments to include the value of all work. There's also an administrative amendment that provides authority to require preliminary inspection prior to issuance of a permit. And then there are administrative amendments that clarify the penalty sections so that we reference the City Code Title I, Chapter 4 throughout all of the codes. Questions? So one of the things that we tried to do in this process is to minimize the number of technical amendments to the codes. There are those administrative amendments, but we did our best to keep the technical amendments to the bare minimum. And most of those technical amendments were for clarification purposes. In the International Building Code, we exempted Group R3 occupancies from fire sprinkler requirements. So that removes the fire sprinkler requirement for 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses. We clarified the requirement for ice barrier to be installed on roofs. We clarified a requirement for an overlay of asphalt shingles and that it's not permitted at all. There were conditions under which it might be permitted, and those are very subjective. So we proposed an amendment that prohibited the overlay of asphalt shingles. And then we also are proposing the adoption of Appendix J, which is related to grading. In the International Residential Code, we filled in the design criteria that's inserted into Table R301.2. That table is left blank deliberately so that we can provide design criteria that is relevant to our specific location. We also, in the residential code, removed the requirement for fire sprinklers in R3. Pathways to solar was amended to require 3 feet around all edges and the ridge. In the residential code as it exists, there are varied requirements based on the amount of coverage on the roof and the type of roof. So for clarification purposes, we felt that it was easier to require the same no matter what the roof coverage was. We require the same access to the roof, not only for inspection purposes, but for fire access. Along with that clarification, we said that 2 pathways would be required on the street side of the roof. The code currently says 1. We also clarified that ice barrier is required and that overlay of asphalt shingles is not permitted. We made an amendment to the gas test pressure to comply with state requirements at 10 pounds, and the 15 minutes is 5 minutes longer than the state requirement, but the 10 pounds does comply with the state requirement. So we did 10 pounds for 15 minutes, which has been a bit of an industry standard for the last 20 or so years. We filled in the blank for minimum sewer depth, and we set that at the frost depth, 36 inches. And then we proposed the adoption of appendices AC and AQ, that's exit terminals. So that talks a little bit about exhaust venting and proximity to openings. And AQ is tiny houses. While that is a fairly minimal amount of information within that appendix, it gives us some basis on which to regulate tiny houses until the state completes the process that they're in which they're developing a code for tiny houses, and they anticipate having that done sometime late next year. So this gives us a little basis to work with tiny houses until then. The only technical amendment to the International Mechanical Code is the adoption of Appendix A. That's a chimney connector pass-through appendix. That talks a little bit about using an existing masonry chimney to vent metal exhaust pipe and the appropriate way to do that. A single amendment to, technical amendment to the International Plumbing Code, and that is to set the minimum building sewer depth at 36 inches, same as we did in previous code. In terms of amendments to the fuel gas code, we coordinated the test pressure requirement for the minimum 10 pounds at 15 minutes. And we also adopted Appendix A, which is again the same chimney connector pass-through diagram that was in the International Residential Code. And we're proposing no technical amendments to the 21 International Energy Conservation Code. Property Maintenance Code has a number of amendments. Most of those were fill in the blank or some sort of fill in the date. So in conjunction with the Unified Land Use Code, weeds cannot exceed 8 inches in height. Insect screens, we were required for both insect screens and provision of heat to provide a to and from date. We decided that a year-round requirement for both of them would be appropriate. We made amendments to the handrail and guardrail requirements in the Property Maintenance Code to coordinate those with the requirements in the Building Code and the Residential Code. The Property Maintenance Code allowed for handrails from a height of 30 inches to 42 inches. The Building Code and Residential Code have been 34 to 38 inches for a long time, at least 5 or 6 cycles. So we coordinated those by making that amendment in the Property Maintenance Code. We also made an amendment to egress and aisles. In the Property Maintenance Code as it's written, it says it'll comply with the IFC. We also said it should comply with the Building Code and the Residential Code. The new code that we're adopting that we haven't had in the city before is the International Existing Building Code. Some of the amendments that we made coordinate with the Property Maintenance Code. Insect screens are required year-round. Handrails and guardrail requirements were coordinated in the same way with the Building and Residential Code. Heat is required year-round. The egress and the aisles were also required in the existing building code to comply with the Building Code and the Residential Code. Replacement egress windows. In the existing building code as it's written, it says that replacement egress windows must comply by fitting the opening of the existing window. That wasn't very clear. So what we said was, and we put it in very clear language, that the replacement egress window cannot reduce the existing net clear opening. Right. So basically, what that means is the existing window, whatever the existing openable area, the net clear opening is, the new window has to have at least that much. Also in the existing building code, we proposed an amendment that a change of occupancy would require a permit and inspection. It talks in all of the codes about changes of occupancy and a need for, during a change of occupancy, for the new occupancy to comply with the codes for that new occupancy. But it wasn't clear how we would enforce that inspection provision or verify that compliance. So we proposed an amendment that would allow us to require a permit at the base fee that allows us to go out and look at that, and also to issue a new certificate of occupancy that is associated with the new business. There are amendments to the International Fire Code, and Fire Marshal Anthony Valdez is here from South Metro Fire Rescue tonight to talk about those amendments. Let's see if I can get those to come up.
Before we do that, can you explain how the ice barriers work? I think I understand how they work. And is that something similar to what other cities are doing as well, is requiring those?
Sure. So ice barrier is to prevent ice damming at the eaves of the roof. It is required in the code when required by the jurisdiction to extend with up to 2 feet inside the exterior wall line on conditioned spaces. In the code, what it said was in areas where there is the potential for ice damming, and there you can reference a map, that ice barrier is required. There are a number of areas that talk about ice barrier related to specific roofing types. And those areas refer you to one section that refers you to another section that talks about in areas where ice damming is likely. So the intent of our amendments on ice barrier was to clarify the need for ice barrier, and then in each of those areas where it references you to somewhere else, to change that language so that it just was clear. When you're looking at each specific roof type, if that was the only place you were to look, it would be clear that ice barrier is required.
Was there any kind of cost analysis done? Is it gonna be significant cost to homeowners?
So it has been required in the previous code cycle.
Okay.
So it is not really a change, it is just a language change. It's not a change in what our requirement has been for the previous 8 years. It is, in our experience, covered by insurance during roof replacement. There's never been an issue with that as long as we make that requirement clear in our code adoption. All right.
Well, good evening. Yeah, I'm Anthony Valdez, Fire Marshal with South Metro Fire Rescue. Appreciate the opportunity to come and present before you tonight. Our code amendments are also similar to what John had mentioned of being a lot more administrative. Fire code has a lot of areas where it states things very generically, such as the grade of a fire apparatus access roadway shall be in conformance with the fire code officials' requirements. So we know what our max grade is for those particular elements, so we try to incorporate that into the amendments so that our designers and contractors have an opportunity to see that ahead of time rather than guessing and presenting something to us. They have an opportunity to design it to those provisions. There are a few other technical amendments that we do, and we'll talk through those as we go. The very first part of the amendment package is really the portions of the administrative parts that municipalities don't have to necessarily do as much. It's kind of inherited with that, being that we're a special district providing services to the city of Littleton, and this is their or your all's code adoption. It's essentially granting us the authority to be able to enforce the fire code on behalf of the city, being that we provide those services, we have the qualifications and so forth. So we adopt 3 appendices out of the fire code. The Appendix B, the Appendix C, and the Appendix D. The Appendix B is for fire flow requirements. So basically how much water is needed for fire protection purposes for the type of building that's being built. Hydrant distribution, so how many hydrants we need for that fire flow and how those are distributed in order to be the most effective for us to be able to provide fire protection services. And Appendix D is further clarifying our fire apparatus access roadway standards. In addition to the standard chapter 5 of the fire code has the basics of it, Appendix D grants a little bit more specific information for our fire apparatus design provisions. And one of the first changes that we do for outdoor assembly events, the fire code requires a permit to be issued when a outdoor assembly event exceeds 1,000 people. What we have found in our experience is that 1,000 is quite a bit of people, and that the level of risk that's associated with that number of people in a congregated area for any specific use or purpose tends to be significant and has an increased risk with it. In addition to, it's also an increased risk in our resources to be able to provide services to an event that size. So we reduced that to 500. And we have found that that's been a pretty successful limit, or threshold for us rather. I should take a step back, and just clarify, we're a special district that provides services to 12 cities and areas of 3 unincorporated counties. This is a very standard amendment package that we have adopted in many of our cities that we serve, with a couple of exceptions here and there meeting the needs of the specific city requirements. But for the most part, this is a standard package. So trying to just provide you some background information that this is not like we adopt very specific things for different cities for different reasons. We try to keep as standard as we can. It helps the whole process. It helps the cities. It helps our designers and so forth.
If I could jump in real quick, Anthony, just another thing for you to know is that we are currently on the 2009 International Fire Code. And so other municipalities that are under the jurisdiction of South Metro have engaged in this process a number of times.
Yeah, this amendment package has been vetted through a couple of cycles. We have it adopted by the 18 and the 21 and a few other jurisdictions. Thanks, John. Appreciate that. Temporary membrane structures and tents, we make a clarification in this where we add air inflated membrane structures. The code says in the black and white of it says air supported membrane structures. We have had several incidents in our district where air inflated membrane structures have not been secured properly, and we've had severe injuries due to those being blown away, children being lifted 30, 40 feet up in the air, and getting severely injured and so forth. So we felt that it was significant for us to try to reduce that risk to our community and have added that to require permits. And we have found a lot of success with that as well. The rest of this section is just basically, it's, yes, sir.
So, a few years ago, some concerns were raised from individuals within the community on this requirement to get, you know, these bounce house permits, if you will, and some of that was probably more geared around not necessarily them flying away, but the actual fan that was used to actually fill those up and carbon monoxide and all those fun things. But I recall a time where there was concern about what was being charged for the issuance of those permits. Does that change for the purposes of this amendment to this section?
So we revamped our entire special event process,
Right.
including our fee structure. And so that is a significantly reduced cost now. It's $75 or $100 depending on the type of permit. If it's a singular bounce house, so to speak, and it's a smaller, probably, you know, the size of this arrangement here, it would probably be exempt from a permit as long as that's the only purpose of it. If it was part of a much bigger event and so forth, then it's encompassed in the overall special event permit. It's not separately permitted. It's looked at as a part of that entire event. Did that answer your question?
Thank you.
Sure.
Are you gonna include that exception in the language eventually, or?
It's difficult to do that because of the nature of every one of these are different. And so our team has some parameters of discretion in order to determine what would meet the level of that threshold. But there's each condition's a little bit different that we wanted to not necessarily, we just couldn't capture everything, all the varying options in there. That can put us in a situation where it would be difficult to articulate.
Okay.
I'm down to section 105.625. So this is an addition to requiring permits for new buildings and tenant improvements. It's something that has always been an accepted practice in the fire code and in the industry, that contractors and designers submit new building plans and tenant improvement plans to fire departments for permitting. But the fire code itself doesn't specifically require that in the body that it is, so we just clarify that by making an amendment indicating, and it's actually an exact quote from the building code requiring the same permit. And the purpose of why we look at those are a variety of reasons. One, we create a similar process that the building departments do in understanding the intricacies of the entire building. It plays a part in how the fire protection systems are designed, how just the overall fire systems such as fire barriers and firewalls and area separations and so forth, and how the sprinkler systems have to be incorporated and designed to meet those parameters, including fire alarm design parameters, egress, all these varying things, and it also compounds into the emergency operation plans that these buildings are often required to have in place, and how they evacuate and how often they do, and if there's fire separation walls, it allows for some opportunity to maybe not egress a vulnerable population to the elements outside, but move them to a safer place within the building, and allowing the fire department to mitigate the incident that's occurring within the compartment and so forth. So without us having the ability to understand that and help that design ahead of time, it'd be too far behind the game if we were just reviewing the deferred submittals of the fire protection and life safety systems. We would be creating a lot more problems for the development community, because we would be going back after the building department had already issued permits, saying, you can't do this because of this, and you got to redesign this and redesign that and so forth. So that's a big purpose of why we required that. And like I said, it's been an accepted practice. It just hadn't been codified, and we codified it 3 editions ago in our code amendment packages. So no change to expectations or anything. It just makes it a little bit more clear. The fire department has a board of appeals similar to you all. What we have done in order to be more collaborative with our partners in the fire service, specifically in the South Metro region, this was a lot more collaborative before South Metro merged with 4 of those organizations. So our goal initially when this was created about 17 years ago was to just create more consistency across the board to help our design and development communities to have a common place to appeal code requirements, and then it would be applicable to multiple jurisdictions rather than one-offs here and there. And so that's been the history of it. Like I said, I think when we started, there were 12 organizations a part of it. That has now shrunk significantly. I think there's still 8 involved. But basically, it's a regional board of appeals. It's members of the fire protection and development community that represent their expertise. We have some fire protection engineers. We have a global developer. We have a general business owner and so forth, to just try to get a diverse representation of and expertise to help process appeals that may occur. And so Littleton, when we did our unification, Littleton Fire was a part of that regional board of appeals to begin with, and so we just carried that over, and it's currently in effect under the current adoption. We made an amendment during the unification to recognize that more specifically, and then carrying it over down to the more formal South Metro amendment package. Violations, just aligning it with the city. Some of these are highlighted just so that we don't miss the correlation, to ensure we're matching the correct sections of the city code.
So you'll probably have to refine the reference to that. That's not the right section.
That's the current one that's in municipal code, so I was just copying and pasting at the time.
Okay.
So yeah, but we do need to correlate that better.
Yeah, and I think for the next council presentation, if you could show the red line.
Okay.
For when we present this to council, so they can see kind of what's being changed.
Sure. Sounds good. The section 503.1 is just acknowledging the adoption of Appendix D. The black and white of the code just stops at 503.1.3. So we're just acknowledging that Appendix D is adopted and it needs to be followed in that section as well. The 503.1.1 buildings and facilities, this is an amendment to the technical portion of it. It's actually allowing for some leniency from the code parameters as they are written, and it allows some exceptions for sprinklering of buildings to allow for increased distances of fire apparatus access to those buildings. So the base of the code requires access to 360 degrees of the building within 150 feet. And we felt that that's a little restrictive in most cases. And so when we are properly protected from a fire protection standpoint, we feel like there could be some leniency with that. So we codify that in this section, essentially saying with a standard commercial sprinkler system, it allows for, we just require access to one approved side of the building. And then our plan reviewers determine what that best side is based off of all the complexities of that building construction. You know, for example, like this building would be very difficult to get 360 degree access within 150 feet, right? But it's also a fully protected building with sprinklers, fire alarm, all those things. So this just allows for that exception. And then a 13R system is typically found in our multifamily structures that don't exceed 4 stories. So apartment buildings and so forth. So it's not as strong of a system in that we're only protecting the occupied areas of those buildings. We're not occupying the attic, or I'm sorry, we're not sprinklering and protecting the attic spaces and concealed combustible spaces and so forth, like a 13 system, what we refer to in a normal commercial structure, because the purpose of that system is primarily for life safety, allowing for the egress of occupants from that building. So in the 13R side of things, we could have a very substantial fire still that occurs, especially in the attic space or the concealed space. So we don't allow as big of an exception, but we do acknowledge that at least it's sprinklered, and we do give some exception there. And then the rest is just, we had to rewrite the exact languages so that it was clear on the other exceptions. Specifications, again, this is just a acknowledging Appendix D is now a part of the adoption, or is an enforceable section of this. The dimension side of so 503.2.1 is again just acknowledging the Appendix D component of it. Surface, here's another one where the section is very generic in the code that just says it should be as designed per the fire code officials' requirements. We require a design that incorporates imposed loads of fire apparatus up to 80,000 pounds. That's what our apparatus weigh, and so we want to make sure that we are structurally designed in order to allow for that to be an adequate driving surface for us. Again, the grade, we know our maximum grade, so we added 6%. We do have the language as or as otherwise determined by the fire code official. So there are times where designers really try to get to that 6%, but are having difficulty in they're more that 7 to 8%. We evaluate that on an as case basis and work with them to try to determine whether that's an acceptable means. Sometimes it's only for 100 feet that they can't do that. So we look at how that access is working with the building and the site and determine whether we can tolerate a little bit greater percentage in grade and so forth. So that's just allowing us a little bit of wiggle room that we find often. The marking section is really just adding the Appendix D reference for the additional information as to what the requirements are. Obstruction to fire apparatus access roads, again, it's just acknowledging Appendix D as amended. Security gates, again, references back to Section D. Section D had more adequate language for that. It was generic otherwise. Address identification, we carried this over from the Littleton amendment. From what I understand, a little bit historical reference that there were some concerns several years ago with proper addressing of buildings within the city of Littleton that had caused some instances of where the fire department had difficulty in locating buildings in time for either a medical emergency or a fire emergency. So we just carried over that, knowing that that was a concern that was presented to City Council and wanting that to be clarified and corrected. Fire flow provisions, again, this is just acknowledging that we're adopting Appendix B in this case. In 507.5, this is just acknowledging that we adopted Appendix C in this case. Emergency responder communication coverage and building. This is these are systems that are often referred to as BDAs, or radio amplification is kind of the common lingo around it. It's essentially systems that go into buildings that allow for better radio communication. So oftentimes when we enter buildings, especially such as similar to this, it's very rock and concrete and steel. Our radios have an extreme difficulty in being able to communicate out to our incident commanders or to our dispatch centers and so forth. It also helps because we share a public safety frequency band with police departments and law enforcement agencies. It also allows them access to buildings easier and more effectively during critical law enforcement incidents as well. And so this is just clarifying some language in that all of our building department. So this particular section says that it should be in compliance with both the building department and the fire department. All of our building departments have deferred that to us just because we have the expertise and the ability to ensure that the engineering of the systems are designed to within our radio communication systems and so forth. So that's all that this clarifies. It's just that you don't need a permit from both the fire department and the building department to install these systems. This section 903.3 is just a clarification because we added one section. It used to stop at 903.8, 903.3.8. We added another section of 903.3.9, and basically it's a clarification to the NFPA standards. So the Chapter 9 of the Fire Code tells us we need sprinklers in these types of buildings under these thresholds, but it says then it shall be designed in accordance with the NFPA standards, the National Fire Protection Association standards. That we felt that there was a restrictive provision that was added to the last two editions of NFPA 13 for spare sprinklers. So systems are required to have X number of spare sprinklers, and it was a really vague section that basically said that you shall have spare sprinklers. Well, what we find is when we have building apartment complexes specifically is where this is most used. When we have 36 buildings in a complex, where do you put those sprinklers? How quickly are they readily available? All these varying elements. So we just amended that particular section to further document how and where we expect those sprinklers to be placed within those buildings. And actually, we just matched the language that had always been there. So it was really not a big industry change by any means. In section 905.4, there was a change in the standpipe provisions. So standpipe systems are the pipes that you've probably seen in stairwells where they have hose connections and a valve attached to them. Certain buildings require us to be able to fight the fire away from the fire apparatus and be interior. Multi-story buildings, for example, high-rise buildings, those types of things. The fire code in the 2021, actually in the 2018 and the 2021, made a change that required those hose connections to be at the alternate floor landing versus the main floor landing. And we, how we are trained and how we are prepared to fight fires in those buildings, we train our firefighters to have those hose connections located on the main floor landing. So we just flipped it back to what it used to be prior to that change, just because that's how we're trained and how all of our firefighters are expecting it to be. Section 1103.7.6. This is chapter 11 of the Fire Code is known as the retroactive chapter, or the provisions that are required in existing buildings. So from time to time, there are portions of the fire code that get amended on the national level to require certain parameters, or certain systems to be installed in existing buildings based off of mostly based off of tragedies that have happened around the country. So, for example, in Chapter 11, one of the requirements is there was an era of our nation where high-rise buildings were not required to be sprinklered. But we're finding that that's a huge risk, not only to the occupants, but a huge risk to the fire department and so forth, and they're very, very difficult. We often see a lot of firefighter injuries, severe injuries with that and so forth. So that is a section of the Chapter 11 of the Fire Code that is in there going into 2021 requiring sprinklers in high-rise buildings. There are no buildings in Littleton that would be affected by that, so we're in good shape. So a little bit of background on that. So then this particular amendment was very restrictive in the way the code is written. So we just reduced it a little bit to make it a little bit more clear when a fire alarm system is required for that particular section, which is in multifamily older buildings weren't originally required to have fire alarms. 5601, it's highlighted because I wanted to make sure we correlated it with all of the city ordinances regarding fireworks. So the fire code does regulate fireworks. Mostly the intent of the fireworks section is to really regulate like the manufacturing of them and the storing of them. So if like a large fireworks vendor were to move into the city, into a warehouse, we have provisions to be able to regulate how and what they can do and can't do and so forth. However, the fire code also incorporates even the use of permissible state use fireworks, also the public displays that we issue permits for and regulate and so forth. So every one of our cities is a little different, and when I supplied these to John a few weeks ago, I was hoping that the city would help me correlate everything to make sure we don't have any conflict with fire code allowing or not allowing something that another ordinance does or doesn't allow and so forth. So that's why it's highlighted. We have no intent. We follow the city's lead on that as to what they want for their city. Some of our cities ban fireworks 100% other than public displays. Some cities allow for the state permissible fireworks and public displays. It's kind of all over the board.
Yeah, I'd say a couple years ago, I did bring to our city council, because the previous exception in the 2009s, I guess that we're using, I like this cleanup a little bit more as opposed to referring to 1.3G and 1.4G and all that stuff, which means nothing to me. But I originally brought it in as a ban to make it consistent, because currently it's really not enforceable. I'm not going to have a police officer or anyone from South Metro go over to someone lighting off a firework and trying to determine if that's 50 grams or less on a fountain. It's like, unless it's obvious and it's aerial and exploding, it's really challenging. But it was amended when I brought it in to allow for sparklers and fountains and those that would be technically allowable at state law.
Mm-hmm.
So the history behind that.
Yeah, and that's really our goal, is to just make sure that we're in alignment with the city's expectations.
But I assumed that South Metro would like to see a ban on fireworks.
We do encourage that does take place, but we also support cities that allow for the state permissible fireworks to be allowed. But I will say that it is, especially coming off just 2 weeks off of 4th of July, and I worked 14 and a half hours and responded to fires after fires after fires due to state permissible fireworks and state illegal fireworks. It's pretty tasking on our resources for sure. The next sections that are deleted, these are sections that are referring to real heavy lifting hazardous material type facilities such as bulk plants, very large storage plants that you would see, like hundreds of thousands of crude oil being stored and that type of thing. Every one of our cities, their local land use provisions do not allow for that type of use anyway, so we just amended to delete it out of the fire code to allow it as well, just so there's no conflict in those particular elements of somebody saying, well, yeah, the land use doesn't allow it, the fire code allows it. It just cleans up things to just be more consistent and have that correlation among all the different requirements. And now we're into some amendments of Appendix B, or the appendices in general. So Appendix B, these particular elements are where the fire code has become very lenient for fire sprinkler systems to basically almost give away all of the fire flow or water supply requirements, trusting that the sprinkler systems are going to operate 100% of the time and no problem with that. As a district and from our experience, although those sprinkler systems are typically in the 90% reliability side of things, we also don't want to get into a situation where we have a large building that basically has one hydrant, and we're going to rely 100% on that one hydrant to provide enough fire flow, one, for it to work, and two, for it to provide enough fire flow for us to do it. So we have kept the parameters of what the earlier editions of the fire code required for fire flow. We felt like those were being more within our risk factors of our district, and so we don't give as big of percentages away for the sprinkler systems. However, we do give up to 50% in some cases and 25% for others. So similarly, back to when I was referring to a 13 system versus a 13R and a 13D, for access parameters, we do the same thing for fire flow as well. We give up to 50% reduction in fire flow for a 13 system and 25 for a 13R and 13D. And that's essentially what all these Appendix B sections are referring to. Down to Section D102, these are just, again, Appendix D is more specifics on fire apparatus access. That first one is just clarifying our weight limit of 80,000 pounds. There's a fair amount of the Appendix D that we think are a little bit too restrictive, so that's where you see some of the deletions in entirety, and then again the grade parameter, we know what that grade is. We amended the dead end section to align with the turnaround provisions that are provided in the fire code, but also where they cannot conflict with the City of Littleton's roadway design standards. So we have found in some cases in our other jurisdictions where the fire code was either more restrictive than the local roadway design, and we don't want to get in a situation where we're creating a conflict in those cases. So this was a way for us to say, here's what we expect, but if they conflict in the city standards will prevail. Signs and widths, this is just, again, providing more specification on how to mark fire lanes, and making it a little bit more clear. It's pretty complex the way it's written. Appendix D1041 for buildings exceeding 3 stories or 30 feet in height. For basically, this is requiring fire apparatus access roads to be a little bit larger and such for our aerial apparatus. So it'll go to 30 feet. It'll go. I'm trying to remember the specifics of what the difference is here. And I'm drawing a blank. I apologize in this particular provision. I'll see if it comes back to me and follow up on that. Appendix D105.1. In the 2021 edition of the code, it created an exception to where if a building is fully sprinklered, then it would get away. That's not the right wording. It would allow for buildings to be constructed without the proper aerial apparatus access. and restricting our ability to gain access to the varying sides of that building. Where we didn't feel 100% comfortable with that is some of the buildings that we would be utilizing our aerial apparatus to make access to the roof and so forth. This would significantly reduce that capability for our what we'd refer to our low to mid-rise buildings. Once we get to our high-rise buildings, the aerial portion of our apparatus is we design ours are either 95 feet or they're 100 feet, and so most high-rises are anywhere from 120 to 250 feet in height. So the aerial component of it isn't as applicable at that point. And so this exception, we just clarified that we were not supportive of allowing all of our low-rise and mid-rise buildings to have this exception because we actually would be utilizing our aerial device to make access to the roof. But we do recognize that it's too restrictive for our high-rise buildings, so allowing the high-rise provisions to kick in and the exception to work in those particular buildings. And then the D1061, which is our last amendment, is just modifying. The current code is too restrictive in our opinion. So we increase the threshold to where 2 separate fire apparatus access roads are required. And then we delete the exception out of that. So I know that's quite a bit to absorb, and I appreciate you hanging in there with me, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
The more you talk, the less John gets to talk, so.
Is there any language in the code regarding barriers around natural gas meters, around large?
That would be more in the mechanical code or plumbing code.
Actually, bollards are covered in both fire and building. So yes, there is language in there that requires bollards. Discusses spacing, that they have to be no more than 4 feet apart. They have to be 4 inches in diameter, concrete filled steel pipe, and things like that. So yes, there is a protection requirement within the code.
Okay, great, thanks.
The building department handles it, so that's why I didn't know the answer
Yes,
to it.
we do.
That's within their scope.
So let me ask, let me play devil's advocate. I'm gonna channel my inner council member. So obviously with the Marshall fire, caused tremendous amount of damage, 1,000 homes basically gone. And recently, a lot of the fuss, and it was probably more newsworthy several months ago, was the cost for individuals to rebuild their homes. And that cost coming, at least in some part, but coincidentally, I think in Superior or Louisville, one of those two, they had adopted new codes. And so that led to a lot of upset individuals coming back saying that now in order to rebuild their codes, their homes, it was costing a lot more. And the numbers, varied from some individuals, opined that it would cost 5,000, some saying 100,000. So I guess my question, and it's not just for you, Anthony, and I think this was more in reference to the Energy Conservation Code. And, they said, and they were just going from 2018 to 2021. And so now we're going from 2012 codes or 2009 as it relates to fire, and we're having to update all the way to 2021. So I guess the question that is going to be asked of you, Mr. Schumacher, is can you even ballpark the additional expense that it would cost for a homeowner to come in here and build a home? Obviously, the idea of affordability is a problem within our city. It gets a lot of attention, and then we come in with new codes, which we need from safety perspective. I mean, the role of chief building official is really safety at all times. Same with fire. But there is that balancing act, and so when I look at the 2021 IECC and I look at requirements that homes be constructed with the ability to support solar. With the requirement that homes be built with the ability to convert from gas to electric, with the requirement that homes be constructed, you'd think I've been thinking about this, with the ability to have electric charging stations for vehicles. All that stuff, great, all that sustainable, renewable, presumably renewable, theoretically. I mean, I guess what are your thoughts on that? Cause I'm channeling at least a couple council members who are going to look at, you know, why are we requiring certain things? It really should be elective on the new home buyer, the home builder. You know, if they wanna add a charging station, go right ahead, but I'm gonna fire up my, you know, my diesel truck and drive around, and I don't need to spend another $500 on something I'm not gonna use.
So first, I'll address things kind of in the order you presented them.
Just for conversation's sake.
Sure, ballparking, that varies, and in the industry, I've heard numbers between $4,000 and $20,000 additional cost on a new home for energy code upgrades.
So that's just IECC.
Correct. In terms of upgrading from the 2012 to the 2021, we are required to upgrade from the 2012 by the state.
Understood.
So we do need to upgrade. So if we're going to upgrade, we should upgrade to the most current version as other municipalities are doing. We do have some flexibility in there in terms of what we're going to do. We could amend the energy code and take some of that out. But I don't think that promotes inconsistency with some other jurisdictions. It lessens the value of the energy code. I think that we have been sort of a little behind in our enforcement of the energy code in relation to other jurisdictions. This is an opportunity for us to catch up and develop some of that consistency. I think that from a cost standpoint and that perspective, I hear more numbers in the 4,000 to 8,000 range than the 20,000. And I think that there's a lot of studies that show that 4,000 to 8,000 upfront investment is recouped pretty quickly in less than 10 years. Things such as the requirement for the roof to handle solar panels. Right now, we require that as a part of our submittal process. We require an engineer to evaluate whether the existing roof can handle that. And quite honestly, can't say that I've had one since coming to Littleton 2.5 years ago where modifications were necessary to accommodate solar panels. A lot of builders offer new packages that already incorporate solar, right? Several of the big builders have their everything included package, and it comes with solar on the home already. The home's already designed that way, but even those that are not specifically designed that way, we've not encountered an issue even with existing homes that the trusses can't. It's a pretty light load, typically about 3 pounds per square foot. And so I don't see that requirement in the 2021 causing an issue that requires an upgrade in the roof capacity over what it typically would be anyway. My understanding from talking to folks within the industry is that there are a number of grants that are being proposed either by the state or at the federal level that will be based in part on compliance with a newer version of the energy code. So I think that the adoption of the energy code, pretty much unamended, I think is not really, and you know, the 4,000 to 20,000 is on a single family dwelling, right? So it would be lesser on some 1 and 2 family dwellings, townhomes, those that are smaller, have smaller roofs, have smaller exterior envelopes, things like that. So the cost is lesser. But long term, there's a great benefit to adopting the 2021.
And so for the other, 13 other codes, any guesstimate as to the cost of understanding that we need to, for a lot of reasons, from insurance reasons, for safety reasons, to update from 2020, 2012s to more current versions, get out of 2012 at least. Is there any guesstimate as to the cost on affordability of homes to meet any of those, like in the IRC? We put that in there, put in the IMC, and plumber's code, all that stuff, like
So
anything.
if you're talking about cost adjustments in relation to the 2012, that's hard to gauge, right? I mean, the market was completely different in 2012 and it's adjusted over the last 8 years. In terms of adopting the 2021 as opposed to another version of the code, other municipalities, a lot of them are on either the 2018 or 21 and are moving to the 21. So for your typical production housing, I don't think that there's any cost difference because those builders are already designing either to the 2018 or the 21. And whether or not we stayed on the 12 or we adopted the 15 or 18, their designs, we're already actually receiving a lot of designs that are based on the 2021 or the 18 on a daily basis. So I don't think that you'll see any sort of cost adjustment within Littleton based on us adopting the 21 because the design is already based on that.
So if I came in wanting to remodel my home, would I be under the existing building code or would I have to now comply with, and let's just say I'm just gonna do almost a complete gut job of the home, over 50% remodel. Am I gonna have to come into compliance with the current iteration of 2021 IECC or some of the other pertinent codes?
You will have to come into compliance with portions of those codes based on the existing building code. And that's one of the advantages to adding the existing building code to our codes is it gives us some options on existing structures in terms of the application of all of the other codes. And it clarifies, used to be that 50% threshold that you mentioned in the code. If you went over 50%, you had to be fully compliant. Using the international existing building code, that's not necessarily true.
So when we refer back to the fire that happened several years ago over at Windermere, my understanding is that building, the community wasn't sprinkled. On something like that, under the international existing building code, that the rebuild of that property, are sprinklers required in that property, or is that something we exempted out and allowed for them just hit that R3 group? Answer. I don't know if my question's very clear.
Yeah, I'm not
We had
sure.
we had a complex that caught on fire, it displaced a number of residents. It got put back together and I don't know how it was put back together.
Yeah, I understand that the type of damage and the type of work that was necessary to get the building back open and occupiable didn't exceed any of the thresholds that would have required more modern codes, even the 2009 fire code to be applicable to that. If you have any other further insight.
So the international existing building code will address some of that. It does address some of that if we adopt that. It does talk a little bit about, it sets those thresholds and those triggers for life safety requirements like that.
One of the changes that you made in here was in reference to the valuation on permits, and I think the change was essentially going from cost of work to cost of all work
Correct.
in terms of that valuation. Can you explain why that change was made, or if that's going to increase permit fees by any measurable amount that you would be aware of?
So the
Or is it
reason,
just too hard to gauge, well, what's part of the actual work and what's not?
so that is part of why we made that correction. So we, in our current amendments to the 2012s, the language is the same. It does include all work, including finished work. And it does, it's not very clear in the language that's provided in the code what work should and should not be included. I mean, it gives you a very base list, but oftentimes there's work that is somewhat subjective and difficult to determine whether it should or should not be included, especially when applying the work exempt from permit list that exempts something such as tile and cabinets and other things like that. By saying all work, it makes it a little clearer. It makes it a little less subjective, and I feel like it makes it a little fairer. It's because the subjectivity is gone from it. It's quite honestly, with new work, we include all work just because we use the ICC valuation table and do it by square footage, right? So that assumes all work that's included in any new work. This helps to clarify on existing structures, the work that's being conducted within those. It removes that need for us to subjectively determine that valuation and say to the applicant, please include all work.
Final question. So in going through the changes that you've made throughout the document, understanding, hopefully it won't be too hard for Anthony to find the red line, but I see, red, I see green, I see blue. For those of us following along right in front of you, like myself, can you explain the different colors and what they mean? I mean, some we are pretty easy to infer, because when we've got a strike through on something, I understand that's gone. But then there's other sections in which I see something in red and I see something in green. It's just kind of repeated. So what am I looking at?
So the text that's in red is the original text that has been proposed to be changed.
Okay.
The green is the actual text demonstrating the change, and then the blue is a brief explanation of the change.
Figure that out.
I thought I put that in the memo that explained.
Maybe in the memo, I was hoping for a table or a legend.
I did have it in the memo to explain why I did the different colors, so I thought it might, sometimes when there's a number of changes within a single section, the strike-through method can be kind of confusing to folks that aren't used to working with the code.
When I ultimately put this in a functioning ordinance, I want to make sure I'm
Yes.
capturing it.
Yes, but for now, for discussion purposes, I thought this
Right?
would make it a little clearer for those who aren't
Yes.
accustomed to working with code regularly.
Okay. I'll stop hijacking the meeting. I'm like Anthony, I'm ex officio over here with
Those are good questions.
All right, we'll continue
my.
on.
But you're gonna hear these things when you go in front of council,
I
so.
know that. Okay. So, there are no amendments proposed to the 1997 Uniform Code for the Abatement of Dangerous Buildings. We have that adopted already. The reason to adopt that, that's the last version of the Uniform Code for the Abatement of Dangerous Buildings. It has been sort of chopped up and placed in the codes in different places, but it's nice to have it in one place. It works well for us to use when we need to issue a notice in order to deal with abandoned or dangerous structures, other things like that. It is the last version. A lot of jurisdictions still use the 97 Uniform Code for the Abatement of Dangerous Buildings, and I'm recommending that we do also. And that is it. We have the 2020 National Electrical Code that's not on the list. It's a separate code, but we are not proposing any amendments to it because the state adopted it without amendment also, and we need to be in compliance and meet the minimum standard that the state adopted. So questions? There's a lot tonight.
Do we mention that homeowners must make a one call to 811 anywhere in the building code or the fire code? Mainly just to prevent them from going to Home Depot or whatever, punching a hole through a gas line, that kind of thing.
We do not.
Okay.
We have that on our website. That's information we provide on there and a link to 811, but it is not required within the building code, and we have not codified that through the building code.
Okay.
That's a state regulation and requirement, and then we just reference that within our information that we provide.
Okay.
You mentioned you've had a contractors meeting a couple of weeks ago. Was there any major pushback on any of these modifications?
There wasn't much turnout. We did send these amendments out in electronic form to approximately 2,600 licensed contractors. We have not received much feedback. Quite honestly, I think that might be because a lot of people have already moved to the 2021, and also contractors are very busy right now, right? So that's why we did it both ways. We had the meeting and sent it out electronically, and we will continue until we draft the ordinance. We will continue to solicit and accept feedback and suggestion.
I have a question about permitting and completion of work deadlines. I know there's a little bit in here about kind of asking for extensions. I've kind of heard of several issues over the last few years, you know, where a citizen might complain that my neighbor kind of started working on this structure, got it framed up, insulated, and then a tarp went up over the wall. And it's been sitting that way for 2 years. You know, they haven't ceased working on it. I hear them, you know, out there on Friday nights banging around sometimes. And I think the homeowners are able to kind of continue to get these extensions on their permits, but neighbors kind of feel like this is, you know, a little bit sightly and something they'd like to have wrapped up. So kind of how does the timeline on permitting work? I believe it's just kind of at the discretion of the building code officer, but there also needs to be justifiable cause demonstrated.
That's correct.
So, like, how does that work out? And if, you know, should there be some type of deadline where this never-ending project, you know, kind of needs to come to an end?
Yes, there should. And so the purpose of our amendment, in which we set the expiration date to 365 days, was so right now in the body of the code it says 180 days. But there's also a clause in there that talks about 180 days if suspended or abandoned. And so that's been interpreted in a lot of jurisdictions that if an inspection occurs every 180 days, and our system, our electronic system is actually currently set up this way, if you request an inspection within 180 days, the expiration date is automatically extended 180 days. And that is how some of these projects have gone on for as long as they have, is they call for an inspection once every 180 days and they get another 180 days. The intent of the amendment is to allow a little longer period, because oftentimes 180 days, especially on homeowner projects, isn't enough time. But typically a year should be enough time for almost any project, other than some larger commercial projects. And by changing the language in the way that we did, there's no automatic extension anymore. You have to request an extension. It doesn't automatically extend just by requesting an inspection. And by doing it this way, that gives us a little more control when projects reach that 365-day point. We can then sort of control whether or not we're going to extend the permit and work with the applicant, the permit holder, to determine why it's taking as long as it is, and to have that discussion that, you know, it's been 365 days, and it help us understand why and what's a real completion date, and we can work with them in that way rather than them having the option to just go into the system, request that inspection, and have it extend on its own. And while 365 days may be a long time for a roof project or a water heater, to be uniform is good in terms of our expiration. And as, again, that 365 days should allow enough time even for homeowners who are trying to learn as they go and do their basement finish or build themselves a garage. 365 days should be sufficient for almost any project.
One question on the exemption of the retaining walls that are not over 4 feet. What was the number in the past?
2 feet.
2 feet.
Yes.
Is there any concern that with allowing them to go up even higher, that they're not gonna put proper drainage behind it and have a wall?
No, that was done in coordination with our Public Works Department, with our new Development Services Manager.
Found it somewhat surprising that screens are required throughout, throughout the entire year. But practical common sense says, okay, that's probably fair. But
So it does ask for a date from
Yeah.
due, right? And so, of course, from a weather standpoint and a natural ventilation standpoint, it's Colorado, we have our days in January where it's 60-some degrees and you want to be able to open things. And also from an enforcement standpoint, it's a lot easier from an enforcement standpoint to just say you have to have screens than, it's 2 days past September or October 30th or whatever, whatever the
no, for
date
sure.
is. It's easier just to say you have to have screens and also you have to have heat, right? Because, we have our days in September, we have our days in May where it's cold, it's snowy, and you have to have heat. And if we were to do dates like from June 1st to September 1st, it starts to become somewhat meaningless, right? It's a little, and from, like I said, again, from an enforcement standpoint, you have those one-offs, and do we want to have to address those one-offs because we put specific dates in there? It's just easier to say you have to have heat and you have to have screens.
I'm just thinking of a situation of, I know people that like to take their screens out of the windows so you don't have to look at them in the winter time, and you open the window for some fresh air, and the code enforcement officer comes by.
So,
It's pretty unlikely that would ever.
and so
Yeah.
just so you understand, we would not be looking like to actively enforce that.
Yeah,
That's something
yeah.
so that if we get a complaint from an occupant who says, I'm renting this place and there are no screens, I can
Yeah.
never open the windows. But we certainly will never be
Yeah, so,
riding around saying, oh, you're required to have a screen. That would only be
If
in
the-
response to
yeah.
something, so. Yes, I don't think that would go over well.
Yeah, I
A
don't
code
think
enforcement
so.
officer was just stopping in the neighborhood saying, you just don't
Screen
have a screen in your
enforcement,
window.
And I learned something new, that people take their screens off during seasons of the year. I didn't know that, so.
If I take mine off, I'll break
Yeah,
it.
they'll get broken.
Kids will destroy it.
I do wanna circle back, I had mentioned that I wasn't recalling the proposed amendment for D 1041 there at the last page. It was to correlate the definition, to match the next section, D 105, really vague in 104. And we found through experience that people were struggling with the applicability of that, so we just clarified that definition to match both sections.
Any other questions?
What do you see as next steps? I think you said this is gonna be presented to council next week.
Go to council next week, we'll get input from council, see if we have a couple of changes that we'll make tonight, a couple of red lines from tonight's meeting, we'll see what comes of that with council. We will incorporate those red line changes from this meeting and that meeting, and come back to you next month. Right now, it looks like, did we get approval for the 10th?
I don't know if we got final approval.
We
had to
were
do
scheduled
it.
for the 17th, but the room is already taken, so we were gonna move the meeting to the 10th. We'll send something out to verify that. But so we hope to be back on August the 10th with those changes incorporated into these amendments, and then talk to you about those changes and request a resolution of support to move it forward in ordinance form to city council for approval.
Does August 10th, if we're able to do that, does that work for you?
It was contingent on you, I think.
Yes, we
Reed.
need to make sure we have a quorum.
I think the clerk's office said, if it works for Reed, we're good.
I'm here every day. Yeah, I thought they gave me another option of another date too, which would be a little bit later. I guess, why don't we all plan on the 10th? I guess my concern, John, is if you get a bunch of council members providing direction that takes you in a strange direction, being able to assemble everything in that, short week or so, to bring it back for formal approval by BBOA. That would be my only concern with doing it on the 10th. But, I just don't know until I hear from city council on Tuesday what they wanna do. But if it looks as if any meaningful changes are small, then why don't we plan on the 10th?
Okay.
And if it looks like it's gonna be worse, then we may have to walk it out maybe another week.
And then maybe we move to the week after the 17th.
I know that I can't remember what board it is, but someone's canceled, so there's an availability date.
Right. Well, we'll definitely notify you, of course, as soon as we know. I'll know after next Tuesday's meeting. I'll have a sense on Wednesday of how long it's gonna take us to make those modifications to the amendments and
Okay, and then hopefully there's not major amendments to be made. Comes back to this board, where we kind of adopt our approval for it to move forward, and then it just goes back to the next council meeting for formal adoption.
no, it won't go until October. It will be put into ordinance format and reviewed by legal.
Oh, okay.
And then will be presented, right now, we're scheduled for October the 4th.
Yeah, so for an ordinance, it requires 2 readings, and so there would be a first reading in front of city council where they set the public hearing. That would happen end of October, and then a formal adoption at the public hearing by city council in November.
So right now,
So-
we're scheduled October 4th and November 15th for those 2 meetings, first and second.
Did we give you enough time to review the? Sure.
What is time?
Any other questions related to the amendments? The process?
Yeah, the only other question I would have was for the outdoor assembly for the International Fire Code. The selection of 500 people versus 1,000. I do recall a few years ago, there was an event they were trying to have downtown Littleton, and I can't remember exactly what happened, but somehow the event couldn't go through. Have you had any feedback from business owners on that number, the 500 versus 1,000?
Yeah, and it's been well accepted by everyone.
Okay.
The parameters of the reasoning that the event that you're referring to was a difference in philosophy and opinion of fees for permits,
Oh, okay.
which we revamped that whole process. We've changed our fee schedule for special events substantially. We took a lot of feedback during that period of time, and I'm fortunate that I'm part of an organization that allows innovation and progression. So I presented a couple of pretty out of the box thinking to our executive team and to our district board, and they bought into what we were trying to accomplish and meeting the community's needs and expectations. And so since we've been able to implement that, which we implemented that in the first part of 2020, we've seen a great amount of success and a lot of positive feedback.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure.
It was the block party, right?
Yes, that's what it was.
Yeah.
That was my first public appearance to the citizens of Littleton on many news outlets and many public meetings.
Yeah, I hadn't started that, so can't blame it on me.
All right, if there's no more comments, the Wednesday, July 20th, 2022 meeting of the Building Board of Appeals is adjourned, and it's 7:55.
Thanks, Anthony.